Hello friends of Powerhouse Bakery and all my favorite divas and dudes out there. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am Suzanne Parker and I'm the owner of Powerhouse Bakery, and today I'm going to show you a fun recipe that really exemplifies folks that are going through symptoms of irritable bowel. I'm going to tell you a little bit about IBS, what we know and what we don't know, and then I'm going to share with you a recipe that follows are the requirements of a FODMAP or a low FODMAP diet. So I want to be able to share with you what is FODMAP, what is that acronym really talking about, and how that might apply to either you or maybe somebody in your family that's trying to identify what's going on in their tummy that's giving them problems. So let's get started. First, we're going to talk about what IBS is. Irritable bowel syndrome. So what we're talking about with IBS is a conglomerate of problems. Doctors really are not sure what causes an irritation in your tummy. Irritable bowel syndrome. Syndrome means it's a group of symptoms and it's also a group of causes. So let's talk about what the symptoms are of irritable bowel. Typically, we're going to have gas, maybe some diarrhea, maybe some constipation, maybe just some pain in the GI tract. And so it can be very vague, it can be very specific. It can happen right after you eat, or it can happen sometime during the day and really give you troubles. And so because we're not exactly sure what's happening with this diet, we're also not exactly sure what's happening with the foods that you eat. So what I want to talk about today is perhaps some of the things that might cause irritable bowel syndrome, and then we're going to go right into that FODMAP or that low FODMAP diet. So when we think about IBS, we know that we've got GI symptoms. We know we've got something to do with when we eat foods, the abdominal cavity, from somewhere from the time that it goes into our esophagus all the way down to the time we use the restroom, we're having some kind of irritation. And so we know that the foods that we eat can sometimes cause the trouble. And so when we think of the causes of IBS, we know that digestion is the issue. So something is having malabsorption, or for some reason the gut is not able to tolerate whatever it is we're putting in there. So we know that digestion is the issue. And of course, we're talking about foods that we are digesting. So when we think of IBS, we know that we're having GI problems, we're having some digestion difficulty. And what oftentimes people think might exacerbate the problem is stress. So now we're talking about the causes. We just kind of said, okay, we know the symptoms are tummy upset, we know probably it has something to do with when we eat, but other things that seem to have underlying importance in the whole scheme of this syndrome is how our body handles stress. We know for sure that our gut is where our immune system builds a lot of our important immunity cells. We also know that in the gut we have serotonin. So serotonin is actually made in the gut, and we know that our immune system is in the gut. And sometimes when we have a stressful response to an emotion or maybe something in the environment, a stress response is sometimes showing up in our symptoms. And so exactly what causes it, we're not sure, but we know for sure that our gut is really important, and we want to make sure that we are taking good care of our tummy. And so over the years, when doctors have been asked to help patients with irritable bowel syndrome, they've really tried to understand what can we do about it. So now the part of the whole equation is what can we do? So the FODMAP is a group of foods, and it's really about how those sugars are digested. So when we look at fermentable sugars, that's where the F comes from. So fermentable. And that just means that the foods that we take in seem to form extra gas in our intestine. Most of the time, our bodies do just fine with managing that gas, and we don't have GI upset. Maybe a little flatulence, but even that is usually pretty well controlled by our own healthy natural flora. But these sugars, for some people, are very fermentable. So what sugars are they? Well, that's where all these terms come in. So the oligo and the disaccharides, so di, and the monosaccharides and the polysaccharides is where we get the low FODMAP, so low FODMAP diet. It's just an acronym that has to do with the types of sugars that we're taking in. So the oligosaccharides are really a complex carbohydrate, so oligo is complex. So you know what we are talking about when we say complex carbohydrates. That would be things like beans, legumes, some flour, so whole wheat, other grains would be oligo, so complex carbohydrates. The other ones would go down the list. The disaccharides, they're a little bit smaller. And so these have to do with maybe the milk sugars like lactose. And so if you have somebody that has an intolerance to milk, it's not an allergy that we're talking about when we think of IBS. If you have a food allergy, then you know you have to take that food out pretty much all the time. If you have a symptom that is fairly short term, so an acute symptom, it might mean that you just have to take that food out for a while. And that's why the low FODMAP diet plan is one that helps people identify what foods are troubling them. And so it becomes really strict at first. You take out lots of disaccharides, all the oligosaccharides, polys and monos, so all the different types of sugars. You try to get the person symptom free, so no more IBS. And then you gradually add some back in to see if one of them is a problem. So if lactose is the problem causing your IBS, now you know that's a food that maybe you just have an intolerance to. But in general, this IBS is treated with identifying what foods cause problems. So whether it's the oligosaccharide, the disaccharide, the monosaccharide, or the poly, then we just know that those foods are ones you have to take out. So the recipe that I want to show you today is a meatball recipe that I've devised that takes out a lot of the common foods in that FODMAP plan. So what we're going to be able to take out are things that typically cause fermentation in the gut that makes that person that has IBS extra sensitive. So we're going to take out tomato, we're going to take out garlic, onion, no beans, no grains, and we're going to try to make sure that it still tastes really good. Typically with meatballs, we're going to want to have a binder, so there will be eggs. We're going to take that out as well, because sometimes people have an allergy to eggs. So if they're following a very strict elimination diet, which is what a FODMAP diet is, they're probably going to take out not only these types of sugars, but they're probably also going to take out other allergens like soy and egg and dairy. So we're going to also say no soy, no dairy, and of course no egg. And while these aren't necessarily part of the FODMAP group, they're still high allergens. So if we're trying to find out if somebody has irritable bowel syndrome because of a food, they're usually going to take all of these out. So this was a fun science project for me, and those of you that know me know that I love science projects when it comes to making a recipe work for people that happen to have a food allergy. So what I'm going to show you is how to make these wonderful meatballs, and I'm going to serve it over this beautiful spaghetti squash. So most of you have seen me take the seeds out of a cooked spaghetti squash. You cut the ends of the silt off, and you cut all around the base, all those little silts are connected to the seeds, and then this little piece lifts right out. Becomes very easy. I got a couple little seeds left in there, so we'll get rid of those. And now I'm ready for my beautiful spaghetti squash. And because I've got a very strict diet plan, and we don't want to add even honey or agave, because again, that would be a polysaccharide, and that would be potentially hard for that person to digest. We're going to keep it really clean and simple, which honestly still tastes amazing. So what I'm going to show you is one of my favorite dressings. I am going to use some walnut oil as my topper and just a small amount of rice vinegar. And of course some beautiful herbs. So this is my spaghetti squash, and I'm just going to drizzle about half a teaspoon of walnut oil. And I'm going to put a little bit of fresh herbs and a little bit of celery right on top of my beautiful herbs. Now, sometimes in an IBS diet protocol, so again an elimination diet, nuts are also taken out. In general, the FODMAP doesn't say no nuts, just like it doesn't say no eggs, but it's an allergen. So I'm not going to put it in this one, but if you are my patient and I've already gone through this diet plan with you and we were able to add in the mighty seeds, I would probably add it in right here. But so here is my beautiful spaghetti squash with the topping that I just added, the herbs. I added some chopped basil and some celery, which are both allowed on the low FODMAP diet. So isn't that lovely? And then look at these beautiful meatballs. So what I'm going to show you is how to make these, and I've done my very own topping. So if you've ever had our spaghetti squash and turkey meatballs, you know that they are so delicious. And I used my sauce and spicy dipping sauce on top, which does have some maple syrup and honey in it. This one does not. So I'm going to show you how to make this without any extra of the oligosaccharides or polyunsaccharides, so that it's part of that low FODMAP diet. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is use some great Jenny O ground turkey. And I'm going to divide this in half. It's a 3-pound chub, so that way we're getting 1.5 pounds of the turkey. And now I'm going to add in some celery. So a 1/4 cup of chopped celery and a little bit of fresh herbs. That's some basil, just the same basil that I used for the topping of that spaghetti squash. And I'm going to add a little bit more. This is always a great opportunity for you to add more of your fresh herbs. You can add parsley, cilantro is really good right now in the cooler weather. You can, of course, add mint and flat leaf. You could add arugula. Just add some that have some great flavors. And you know, fresh herbs are so good on your gut as well. It definitely helps to improve the immune system. Anytime you get bright greens, we know that that's adding lots of important nutrients to our gut, building our immune system, and it's great to add into our diet. Whether you're following an IBS plan or low FODMAP, adding herbs is always a thumbs up. So normally what's missing, normally what we put in a recipe that includes ground meat is a binder. We would normally add egg, maybe even add some oats or cracker crumbs like you might do at home. But because we can't include any of those, I'm going to show you how to make one that's really healthy still. Okay, so the first thing we're going to add is some flaxseed. It's a pretty easy ratio. We're going to add flaxseed, sesame oil, and some cassava flour. So you're going to be able to see this recipe, and if it's something that you want to do, your family is going to love you for it. So I've added some flaxseed, and I'm going to add a little bit of sesame oil. Now, the flaxseed is a great binder. If you've ever made a vegan dish and you're trying to do an egg replacer, that flaxseed is really good for just that purpose. So it's going to form a nice paste. So far, I just have the sesame oil and the flax, and now I'm going to add some rice vinegar. And what I love about rice vinegar is it's a little bit sweet, but it's not enough to really count as a sugar. And so some diets will say no rice at all, and if that's the case, then I would add apple cider vinegar. But in this one, I'm going to show it to you with the rice vinegar. I've got one more ingredient, and again, this is my egg replacer as well as the grain replacer, because in this special recipe, we're trying to leave out all those items. So now I'm going to add some cassava. So this is a great starch. It's not a grain. It's a starch that comes from a cassava root. And so I love this product because on any diet that says no grains, this one is legal. It's kind of a slippery slope if you ask me, because it sure looks like a flour, right? And for all intents and purposes, in recipes, it acts just like a flour. But, at least our hope, is that in the gut, it's not quite as reactive as a wheat or a rye or a barley or even like an almond flour. This one would be just fine. So we want to, again, avoid allergy-specific foods, and the cassava is one that works just fine. Okay, so I'm going to let that sit just for a minute. It's going to gel up, and it's going to be a great way to add thickener to my turkey meatballs. Now, the other thing I'm going to combine is my flavors. So you can use Himalayan sea salt, you can use regular sea salt, or just table salt. All of them are really going to taste the same. But I always encourage you to blend your spices in a small dish first and then sprinkle it over your meat, so now you can really mix it well. So I did 1½ teaspoons of salt. And here is my fabulous seed blend. This is dill and fennel. Half of it was ground up and half of it was left whole. I honestly love having little bits of seeds in the finished product. I think it just adds wonderful texture, not to mention some great flavor. And then I'm going to add a little bit of smoked paprika. So about a teaspoon of that. The smoked paprika is also going to go in my wonderful sauce at the end. So that one's coming back for sure. So now I've got my spice blend put together, which is absolutely gorgeous. I'm going to mix this well, and then I'm going to sprinkle it onto the meat. Sprinkle as much as possible so you get a good spread of all those. Just don't dump it in one place. There we go. And now you can use a gloved hand or you can use a clean hand and just mix the meats with all those wonderful spices and veggies. So again, we're leaving out onion and garlic very specifically because that's those two vegetables tend to have a lot more fermentation that happens in the large intestine, thus causing those IBS symptoms. So we just want to leave them out as much as we can so that we can find out if in fact there is an allergy to certain foods. And hopefully once we identify what food allergies are present and we let the gut rest, there's even a good chance you could bring back some of those culprit foods, but just in a less amount. And that's a really important note, because if it's a true food allergy, not an intolerance, if it's a food allergy, you can't really bring any of it back. It's enough of a response of your immune system to say, no, I don't ever want to see it. An intolerance means that there's probably a threshold where you could easily tolerate some and be okay with it. Okay, so that's beautifully mixed. Now I'm going to use my little baller and I'm going to make meatballs. So you can absolutely use a baking sheet at home. I do recommend that you cover it with parchment or foil would be just fine, just so you don't have any sticking. So I'm going to do nice little round balls, and sometimes it's good just to finish up the ball with your other hand, just to kind of round it out and make them look really pretty. And you can easily double this recipe. So notice I just did half of the container. So the other thought is, if you get a 3-pound chub of the Genio turkey, which again is one of my favorite products that HEB carries, you can do half of the batch really specific like this for somebody that has a sensitivity. So if you're having guests over, you could have 2 different kinds of meatballs, and just know that it's easy to divide this recipe or to multiply this recipe. If you keep it as is, you're only using half of that container, and it becomes easy to use the other half in one of your classic favorites that might include some barbecue sauce or onions or garlic. And everybody can eat from the same table that way, because now you're making enough for everybody. And I love these 3 pounds of the Genio product because it's great to freeze also. All right, so there's my beautiful meatballs. And now we want to make the topping. And this is the part where I think is so good too. Let me show you what we're going to do. Okay, so I'm going to get another container, and we are going to do a combination of a couple of really easy ingredients. Now what I have here is some enchilada sauce. When I first designed this recipe, I didn't have any enchilada sauce, so I got some a little can of Ortega chilies and I blenderized them up, which was even better. But this is so handy, so you can use either one, and I've put them in your recipe like that, so you know you can use either one. So I'm going to use 3 tablespoons of either blenderized chilies or some enchilada sauce. And here comes this beautiful paprika. So good dose of 1 tablespoon of paprika. Don't skimp on your quality of paprika. This is the best spice when it's fresh. So delicious. And once I stir this up, I'm going to add in the thickener, which again is that cassava. Now I didn't put the flaxseed in this stage because I don't want it to have a texture. This is supposed to be as close to a barbecue sauce as possible. And look how pretty the color is. So nice. And then when I add in my little bit of cassava, it still has that bright, beautiful color. So that's about a tablespoon. Now I can also add in some essential oil in this stage. If you wanted to add a little bit of cilantro oil, you could totally do that. In fact, I think I will next time. That sounds so good. But the goal here is to make it nice and thick so that it easily looks and even tastes a lot like a barbecue sauce. Now we definitely need to add a little salt. So really, again, very simple, easy ingredients. So maybe just 1/4 teaspoon. Now, interesting, on the FODMAP diet, it does not take out pepper. You could use pepper, but in all honesty, I do leave it out because sometimes people that have IBS are sensitive to spicy foods. And so paprika is wonderful, parsley and mint and basil, all very soft spices. So when possible, use those when you're working with somebody that has a tummy sensitivity so that you don't exacerbate the problem, even if it's just from a spice. Okay, so here are my beautiful meatballs, and now I'm ready to dress them. And the nice thing is this is going to be a really quick, easy item to cook too. It's going to take about 12 minutes at 425, and they come out so nice. And you can put this sauce in a squeeze bottle and just kind of dazzle each one on the top. I'm going to show you in a second what I did on that first batch. I actually like it when the sauce is kind of all over them. So first I'm going to get a little dab on each of those. Now also notice that I'm putting the sauce on the raw meat and I'm double dipping, right? So I'm letting that spoon touch the raw meat and then back into my sauce. So that means that now this has to get either cooked or used and cooked, because anytime we touch raw meat, there's a risk of cross-contamination. So be really careful with that. So I'm just going to dab all around it. Make sure I get plenty of that good sauce. Another way that I did it was I just dredged that meatball all in my beautiful sauce, because again, that's such a delicious way to top it. And as we know, the eyes eat first, and it's so good when they have a beautiful bright red-orange color from that paprika, and it makes it such a wonderful plate presentation. And then at the very end, you can also add some fresh herbs. After they've come right out of the oven, they are ready for an extra little garnish. If you don't use spaghetti squash, you could use some zucchini noodles, or they call them zoodles, or you could just eat them plain. What we wouldn't do is serve them with rice, because of course rice is a grain that we're trying to omit. So you couldn't use lentils, you couldn't use any kind of pasta or rice, because on that low FODMAP diet, we're taking out all grains. But thank goodness for the spaghetti squash. We have this wonderful option that looks and kind of serves like a pasta, and it becomes a wonderful option when you're trying to treat and identify symptoms of GI intolerance, which we kind of put under that big umbrella of IBS. So I sure hope that you're not suffering from IBS, but if you know somebody that has a sensitive tummy, this is a great recipe for you. So I hope you enjoy it, and hope to see you soon at Powerhouse Bakery. See ya!